do an intro of Michael. So it's always a good week when you get to introduce both your bosses. I got that honor earlier in the week to introduce Fiona, the commander of the British Empire, who's one of my bosses. And now I get to introduce Michael, who's not a commander of any empire, but a very accomplished person in his own right. So what I like most about Michael is the incredible breadth of interest that he has. So on top of being the Koch Professor of Engineering, he's Associate Dean of Innovation for the School of Engineering. He's a co-director of our initiative. He's the faculty director of Lemelson. What's really interesting about Michael is that he does have 80 patents, which you kind of expect from an MIT professor, and is certainly very relevant to this discussion this morning. But he also has done 5 startups, which is, well, not unusual, but also I think in its own way extraordinary. But the interesting thing about those startups, and correct me if I'm wrong, Michael, is that while having a BS in chemistry and a PhD in chemical engineering, they're all in medical devices, and you've never taken a biology class.
Right.
So that shows kind of a willingness to try new things. And on top of that, I think Michael's other interests are chocolate and glass blowing and anything with a very large engine, because every time he joins us on one of our staff meeting games, he's somewhere fixing something with an engine. Usually a boat, sometimes a tractor, occasionally a broke down car. So I think it's that really interesting kind of variety of background that makes Michael a great person to talk about the topic that we have this morning. So without further ado, our boss, Michael Cima.
All right, give me a second to share with computer sound. There you should see, one of the boats, and I will now start the. Do you see the title slide?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So this title was assigned to me. It was not something that I picked. Inventors and Inventing, and as was said, I am an inventor, but in the process of innovating, as we'll get to next, I realized that while inventions are a important part of many innovations, they're just a part, and it's an important tool for intellectual property in general. Whether you're talking about patents or copyright or any of those things, are important tools to actually fulfill your innovation, to build your innovation, to actually build your dream of what you saw the innovation to be. The headwinds for intellectual property in general are pretty tough. The statutes that support both inventions and copyright are behind the times usually. In other words, they are designed for the intellectual property of the past and not what's happening now. So if we talk about AI, for example, both the statutes that support copyright and inventions and don't really envision products that incorporate that kind of innovation. And so true innovators are faced with some real challenges in protecting intellectual property. Okay, so but I guess the week is really spent about, and the whole effort by the team here is on innovations, and we've used this sort of definition at the bottom numerous times this week, that the MIT definition is the process of taking ideas from inception to impact. But I think the world thinks of it more like the Oxford English Dictionary, and and says it's making changes in something established. And that's where I get hung up right there, is that, yes, that fits the MIT definition, but a lot of times, some of the most important innovations are establishing something new, that their connection to existing establishments is tenuous at best. Now, we saw some examples yesterday. Sanjay Sharma, mentioned Uber. Yes, vehicular transportation, people driving their cars, looking for parking places. Yes, that was an established mode of operation when Uber came on the scene. So yeah, I would classify that, something established, and we were changing it, introducing a new idea. But there are a lot of things that the connection to, the established mode of operation is pretty tenuous. So, who would have started the drone phenomenon that we have today with the idea that people would want to film themselves, or that a whole industry could be created by changing the way we manage crops? Yes, there was people would take pictures of themselves. People would, manage, there was an industry to manage crops, but no one would have started the idea of building a drone with changing those established operations. And so the whole point of this slide is to convince you that in MIT's definition, not only do we capture the OED, we capture the idea of just creating new modes of operation, operations that didn't exist before. I mean, it's like the case, it was, all of us on this call can remember a time when, yes, we would make personal calls, but if somebody were to say, hey, we're going to put a computer in your pocket, none of us could have imagined actually needing that. It's a very different kind of thing. Okay, so I'm going to tell you all the points of my little talk today in this slide. I like to do, I give a whole talk on this topic. I'm just going to give you a very abridged version of it. Do inventors know what they're doing? And so it's like the case of the drone. I can invent a drone. Do I really know what it's good for? And the answer to that question is, more often than not, no. Then I'm going to talk about where ideas come from, because I think most people, when they're trying to innovate, are looking for ideas. And my response to students trying to do this is, don't look for ideas, but look for places to look for ideas. And so where do the ideas come from? They come from environment, they come from adjacencies, they come from constraints. This is like super important. Having constraints, actually you get the worst ideas when you're unconstrained. Actually, there have been lots of interesting experiments with people in ideation to show if you relax constraints, the quality of the ideas that come out of that process is lower than if you impose constraints. If you impose too much constraint, the idea quality goes down also. So that's a really important thing. And then this last point I'm going to give some examples on is good ideas come from concepts. They are not really fully formed ideas, but they are concepts of where you might find good ideas. And then something, I attended the talk by Elspeth Johnson earlier this week, and some of the team have seen my responses. I very much resonated with her response to a question from the audience. I can't remember who asked it, about the role of stories in human behavior. And I can tell you, I'm one of these guys that fills up 9 boards of equations when I do a lecture. I mean, I'm serious. I mean, I have like super math heavy classes. But after 34 years of doing that, I've come to the conclusion that none of that sticks with people. What sticks are the stories that I tell. And so I'm gonna, my last slide will actually be about this topic. Okay, so now I'm gonna take you back 34 years. When I arrived at MIT, this study was just being published. It's called Made in America, and it ended up being a very influential study. It was cited all over, and it was cited in congressional testimony. It was, there were op-ed pieces written about it. It was a pretty big deal. And it was about what was happening at the time. Most politicians, most labor unions, most people working in these factories were worried by the fact that factories were moving overseas faster than you could count. And it was a worrying time. But even more worrying to people at MIT was the fact not only were factories moving overseas, but design was moving overseas. Our students were finding it easier to get jobs. Presumably the engineers that we train at MIT are heavily involved in product design. They were going to find jobs, not in the US, but overseas. Big change in mindset. So this was sort of the clarion call. And why were they people concerned? Well, these automobile factories, well, let me put it more bluntly. What we were doing at MIT was changing rapidly in response to this. And what were we responding to? Well, many things, but one of them, the one that I got involved in, was represented by this image. This is obviously an American automobile manufacturing facility. But in the late 80s, it took twice the time in Detroit to design and build the first car of a new series that it did in Nagoya. Twice the time. So it meant Toyota and Nissan and all these car companies could respond to consumer demand much more rapidly than any of the Detroit companies. And so this was a problem that not just at MIT, but many engineering schools across the United States started to focus on, was the time it takes from the idea to the first of something. How do we reduce that? And of course, there's many elements to that. So here was the environment of the late 80s. So the problem was this product design going overseas that I just described, and the time it took to make the first of something. But there was also, the environment was, of course, broader than that. The late 80s was the time of the most rapid growth in distributed, inexpensive computing. So like individual workstations was being, just blowing exponentially, just blowing it out of the water. And it was cheap. You remember the IBM PC and all of that. It was amazing what was happening. Not so much known to the general public was this other very rapid trend, partly because of the inexpensive computing, but new software was becoming used. So prior to this, if you were designing a product, you did what I would call drafting. So drafting is a drawing of the product you want to build, and it includes lines that are actually the intersections between surfaces. That's what drafting was. It was drawings like that. And I remember in high school doing those types of drawings, and they were all dimensioned, so you could hand them to the machinist for the machinist to actually cut the part. By the early 80s, there was software that would do drafting, would help you draw those intersections between surfaces that defined a part. That's how you define the part. And it was the machinist that interpreted those intersections to make a surface. By the late 80s, all of a sudden there was a new software tool. It was called solid modeling. And there, the designer didn't draw the intersections. They effectively drew the surfaces directly. Imagine a mathematical surface. I hate to get into the math here. A mathematical surface that of each of these surfaces, and the computer determines the intersection itself. But what's in a computer no longer is the intersection. It's the actual surfaces. So that was happening. The final thing that was in place, this is part of the environment, was what's called CNC machining. It was, people had already started writing, and actually many years, some of the first of these were at MIT in the 1950s, was driving machines to cut metal or cut plastic to make a object. These were complicated instructions to moving a cutting tool into a block of metal to cut it out and release or produce a product, a shape that you wanted. This was already in use. The problem with CNC machining was that you can't make any shape. Now imagine taking a cutting tool and cut out the inside of something. You can't get the machine in there. So there was a huge topological constraint in making things that were useful in product development. And so complicated, there was a lot of the time involved in making the first of anything was going through the iterations necessary to make the internal shape, the external shape, make the tooling, cast the part. Oh, it would take forever. This is where this was the environment. Now, out of these adjacencies came not just at one place, almost at the same time, at least 4 places across the United States, came the idea that, hey, we could use these solid models to drive a new type of machine that would not have any topological constraints. That was the idea. No topological constraints whatsoever. These 4 inventions, they were literally 4 separate inventions, happened about the same time. And, you know, it's really interesting because if you look at other areas where intellectual property grows, they often happen in disparate places near at the same time. How can that be? Well, it's because all inventions come from their environment, their adjacencies, come from earlier ideas. All the things have to come together. And once they're there, there's a lot of smart people everywhere. And you make these things. So this is, you know, only one of these was invented at MIT, the one on the lower right. But the first commercial use of this was a small company in Southern California called 3D Systems, which still exists. I mean, obviously in a different form. And this was called stereolithography. 3DP, as we know it here, is a powder-based thing, whereas this was using a laser that would photocure a complicated resin. But there's a number of these technologies. It was small groups, disparate places in the United States. It was all in the United States. And we all knew one another. We get together every summer in Austin, Texas in August. We would meet in Austin, Texas in August simply because that was the cheapest hotel rates. I mean, seriously, I mean, it was the worst time of the year to be in Austin because it's like deathly hot. But this is where we would meet, small group, the Solid Freeform Fabrication Conference, SFF conference as we called it. And we would all compare our parts that we would make. It was very interesting. Now I want to introduce what I call the real innovators in this game, because they were people much like yourselves. They were people at large multinational companies that found out about this. And these people all believed that these technologies, as crude as they were at that point, were going to impact their industry, not just their company, but we're going to impact their industry. I'll point out Dick Aubin here for a second. Unfortunately, he passed away a number of years ago. But Dick, you know, he was banging on the doors in the C-suite, but he would also bang on doors in Washington. He made sure, for example, DOD knew that, you know, UTC's businesses, big, you know, government contractor, but UTC's businesses were going to be affected by these technologies, and DOD better invest in these because their future products were going to be, or, you know, they're not their products, but their access to new technologies was going to be determined by this crazy idea. And so this, we're talking over 30 years ago now. No one had ever heard of 3D printing before. And without these people, I guarantee you that the industry would not exist today. Why? All of these companies bought these machines from all the, you know, in our case, we created all these licensees for fields of use, and 3D Systems was doing stereolithography. So it was kind of a limited material sets, and there was only a few things that they could do. So they were buying these machines, even though they were by any measure lousy at that point. They could not come close to competing with CNC machining as far as dimensional tolerances, as, you know, surface finish, all of these things. Why did they invest? Because they were not investing in those machines. They were investing in a future industry. They wanted to create that industry and actually dictate the course of the growth of that industry. None of these companies wanted to make 3D printing machines. It's a very interesting model. Actually, the electronics industry has a long history of doing this sort of thing. Tool makers, you know, that make specialized tools for making chips have that kind of relationship with the, you know, the Intels out there and that kind of thing. They build and actually cite people in these small startups to create that industry. So, you know, create that tool. It's a huge, I mean, this mode of innovation, without these large companies, you would not see this industry today. Okay, so the history at MIT, we made machines, parts. I mean, for a period of 15 years, we had a large group, my co-inventor, Ellie Sachs, myself, countless number of students at MIT. We had spent millions of dollars of research, many millions of dollars of research, had a lot of corporate sponsors, of course, had DOD sponsorship. We had NSF sponsorship. I call out the NSF because they were the first government agency to bet on this crazy idea. And we learned a lot. And now let's fast forward, you know, 30 years. A visit to Barcelona. Here you see the Sagrada Familia, the Gaudi Cathedral. That's, I think it's actually almost done. This is still under construction, but it's been under construction for 100 years, kind of thing. I got a VIP tour, and the reason why they gave me a VIP tour is they wanted me to go to the model shop. And in the model shop, are two Z-Corp machines. They were one of our licensees, and they make the kind of models that you see up here in this corner. You know, they're models to demo the, you know, it's all privately funded. So they show, you know, we're going to make this nave with your money. This is what it will look like, kind of thing, to the rich supporters that come by to do this. And you know, in fact, it was interesting when I visited that day. There was a reporter from the local newspaper and did an interview, and then that Sunday there was a big article about 3D printing and all this kind of stuff, and how it's impacting industry in that part of Spain. And you know, that part of you know, this is example. This fulfilled our kind of vision, right? So that architects and donors could actually see and feel what the object was that they were going to build, to debug it, to do a lot of the debugging before it actually was going to be committed to manufacturing. That was not only our vision at MIT, but all of those groups that I said across the United States. That's what it was. We were going to make prototypes so that designers could test their ideas before they committed to manufacturing, to rapidly get the first of something so you could check out, does it work? Well, now let me tell you another story. Go back 25, almost 30 years ago. I go to group meeting one day, and Ellie and I used to have joint group meetings. So all of our students would come together, and we would hear the, you know, what was happening in the lab, debug certain things. You know, sometimes we would meet in the lab. It was a large group of students. And two students showed up with this one day. And this is a great blow up. This is actually very tiny. They used to build dozens of these at a time. So this is very small. So you can actually see the layers that are here very easily, right? Because this is so small. And they said, oh, this visiting artist at MIT had a solid model for the Hagia Sophia, this mosque in Istanbul. And he came by the lab and said, could we build this for him? And we looked at the file and said, sure. So they built him a couple of these, and they built a bunch for themselves. and we said, that's cool, very nice of you to help out an artist. And they said, one of them said to me, turned to me and said, Professor Cima, you know the coolest thing about this part is that the rooms are inside. Because the solid model included that detail. And you know, this is one of the first hints that people were going to use this technology for making parts that couldn't be made any other way. If you were going to make this by 3D or CNC machining, you would have to make the outside and another part and assemble, you know, like the walls. It would be the only way to do it would be to make something that you assemble, lots of parts that you'd have to assemble. This part was made in one go. First hint. Next hint came from a visit to one of our licensees. So one of our licensees is a company called Soligen. Their business idea was that they were going to be in the industry of investment casting. Basically, investment casting is you make tooling for refractory tooling for casting metal parts. So you make a ceramic core and a shell, and you put risers in, and you pour this metal into this complicated mold that solidifies, and then you break it out and clean up the part, cut off the risers and stuff like that. And they said, we are going to make the shell and core integral in one go out of refractory. So the customer would send us a solid model. We would design the shell and core, you know, the mold essentially out of refractory materials, quote a price. The customer would accept, it would go to our 3D printer, They would build the shell and core, fire it, send it to their foundry, cast the metal part, cut off the risers, and ship the part back within 1 week. And they felt their business was going to be, you know, like GM part down here, this complicated manifold. And which it's not just the complicated outside, it has a complicated inside, just like these parts. That's what they thought their business was. 1 week turnaround. You know, normally this would take 3 months, not 1 week to get a part like this. Now this is a real part. You know, it's not, I mean, this gets bolted into a real engine and it runs. And it's made actually the same way that they would, you know, they would make this part by casting. So it actually allows them to prototype an engine. So I was out there and I was you know, just sort of visiting, and I see these parts. And, you know, I asked the CEO, I said, you know, these are not that complicated. You know, I knew enough about casting to know that, you know, why would somebody pay you to make these parts? And the CEO turned to me and said, you know, Michael, can you take a guess at what the world demand is for the pump that this goes into? This is a pump housing, is what it is. I said, I have no idea. He said, well, these 5 pump housings will supply the entire world demand. The world demand for these pumps is 5. If they had to make these by making the tooling and, you know, doing the normal thing, the cost of this one part makes that pump not economically feasible. So here's the 2 data points: making parts that can't be made any other way and doing short-run manufacturing. Those 2 data points, users demanded that before we knew they were going to demand that. It was, we envisioned all these technologies as prototyping tools, not for manufacturing. But that's what in fact, I'd argue their biggest impact, all of these technologies, not just MIT's technologies, all of them, is something that you don't generally see, but is actually used, these technologies are used in short-run manufacturing. I'll give you an example. Align Technologies. You or your kids have used Invisalign products. Those products are actually made in a factory where this tooling used to make them, each tool is made by stereolithography. If you look closely at the surface of this retainer, you can see the lines from the layers in the stereolithography product. I know the guy, at the time, I knew one of the salespeople at 3D Systems, and we would meet in Austin, Texas. And he said, one day he talked to one of their customers and said, their customer said, they're gonna make 1 million parts next year. He went to the sales meeting and told people, and from that day onward, 3D Systems envisioned themselves not making prototyping tools, but making manufacturing tools. It was not an idea in the company, it was an idea of one of their customers. It's extremely powerful. This whole thing for me was an extremely powerful thing, because where I found ideas, I now found ideas, is not just at MIT, but it's with my potential customers. Oh, and this has just gone crazy. I mean, 3D Systems bought ultimately Z Corp, so now the MIT technology is licensed to 3D Systems. They do stuff like this here, which is kitchen-ready 3D printers. I mean, they make stuff that like candy that's actually used primarily by bakers, you know, like commercial bakers and things like that, for doing crazy stuff. This is manufacturing. It's not prototypes, it's manufacturing. The other thing we did not appreciate was the future of shapes, that there would be a market for shapes. And I'll give you just one example. Shapeways. It's an interesting site. I mean, you can go there and you can sell your shapes. You can actually upload a design and you can sell it to other people using either solid freeform fabrication processes or machining or whatever. But you don't realize with all these little things which you want to order here is that you click on them, you go to another page that says before you get charged your credit card, it says, what do you want it made out of? And you click, oh, I want it to be stainless steel. Press on stainless steel. And all of a sudden, the bunny that you wanted comes in the mail, just like Amazon, a stainless steel bunny. I could have picked a ceramic one. I mean, it's what you don't realize is behind each one of these little bunnies, different materials, is a different solid freeform fabrication machine that's optimized for that material. Who would have envisioned this? Okay, so my life has not been just 3D printing, even though a large, 15 years of it was. Ellie and I looked at one another. We had all these licensees. The industry was, after 15 years had grown substantially. These companies have professional engineers, and our job at MIT is not to hire professional engineers, is to hire people that are smart, that know nothing, and change that. And so we said, hey, we're probably done with this at MIT. And so we said, let's reinvent ourselves. And so I focused on the concept. Like the concept was rapidly prototyping something. Where else could I rapidly prototype? And I have actually done a lot of consulting from the beginning, for odd reasons, but from the beginning of my career, consulting in the pharmaceutical industry. And I done a lot of consulting on doing things I would largely classify as formulation. It's like not just the active ingredient, but all the stuff that makes the active ingredient actually work. And so for example, it's the excipients that go into a tablet. It's the solid form of the low molecular weight drug. It's the buffer used in the manufacture of the monoclonal antibody. All of that stuff has surprisingly important implications on whether or not that molecule or that antibody actually becomes a therapeutic product, a drug. And I can tell you that when I first started working in this area in the late 90s, it was just by accident. I mean, the level of understanding of how to do that with rigor didn't exist. It was these guys in development, or women and guys in development, would work just with stuff that they were familiar with, and it was just completely Edisonian. No science really involved in that. And it was really tough. And people that invest in the molecule, huge investment, they couldn't even get to the point where they could test it in the animals, because they couldn't do a tox experiment because they couldn't get the exposure of the molecule in the animals. And this would go on, I'm not talking months, but years. It would be stuck in development from the preclinical or, the in vitro assay to actually dosing the animal, let alone dosing the human. Really tough. So I got the idea with a number of other people. I was actually consulting at a Millennium Pharmaceuticals, who's actually, this was technically not an MIT spin out. It was a spin out from Millennium. But I was doing this work at Millennium, and a couple of guys there and I started thinking, hey, let's use the high throughput platforms that they would use for drug screening. Let's use them for formulation development. And one thing led to another. We actually got Millennium to let us, spin this out for very little money. In fact, it was no money. It was just stock in the company. And we started a company, Transform Pharmaceuticals, where we just filled up the place with robots. I mean, this was engineer heaven, geek heaven. I mean, we had robots making, different solid forms. We had them doing unusual formulations like transdermal formulations. We had them doing parenteral products, buffer screening for monoclonal antibodies. It was, we were just having a blast. And it got a reputation amongst the young people across the nation of being the cool place to work. So we had people beating down our doors trying to get into work. It's fantastic. It was ultimately acquired by Johnson & Johnson. But by that time, all the major pharmaceutical companies were our clients. We had, it was spectacular. So not only were we, doing crazy stuff with robots, but we were involved in a lot of the key development programs in these large pharmaceutical companies. Super cool. I'm going to skip the next slide, a couple of slides, because I don't want to, just shows you what it did. Now, it was a great experience, proved that we could do it. I can say, while that company was acquired by Johnson & Johnson, we changed the way pharmaceutical products are developed, because basically all those companies now do something like what we were doing in their development. Let's go to concepts. Let's find new ideas and concepts. So the concept that was behind this project was that I could add new capabilities to existing medical procedures. So, a lot of physicians, particularly specialists, do procedures. That's how they get paid. They do procedures. In this example, urologists. If you look at the income of a urologist, it's largely dictated by the procedures that they do. And the other concept that I had been working on was single compartment delivery of drugs. A lot of the big problem in designing a molecule to be a drug is getting it to the target tissue, and not having the systemic exposure cause toxicity. And so you lose a lot of really important molecules because you can't target it to the compartment where the disease is located. So, for example, in the bladder, if you want to target the bladder, giving a tablet so oral administration has the problem that before it gets to the bladder, it goes to the rest of the body. And so how do you manipulate the molecule to prevent the damage associated with getting that potent agent to places that you don't want it to be? And so that's the concept that I had was, let's figure out ways to bypass that constraint. Let's figure out ways to get the drug directly to the compartment where the disease of interest. So like the bladder, the tumor compartment, the brain, any of those things. How do I get it directly there? Well, marrying these two concepts is, what if I took existing procedures, a catheterization of a patient, and turn that into a way of delivering drug and sustained drug? And this was one of the crazy ideas. We fill a silicone tube with drug. We put a laser drilled hole in the side of it. It's a dual lumen silicone tube, but it's got a nitinol wire spring in it. So when you catheterize the patient and you push this thing out in the bladder, it folds up into this pretzel-like shape that stays in the bladder till you go in and do another procedure to pull it out. You say, oh, that sounds terrible. You have to do another procedure. Well, to the urologists, they love it. They get paid to do that. And they do it in their office. They don't have to pay anybody else to do it. So it's like super, it fits the channel, so to speak. So we did this at MIT. We created a company, Taurus Biomedical. that went and did this. And so now I'm going to show you the only data slide that I'm going to talk about. And this was their first phase 1 study in muscle invasive bladder patients. Now, bladder cancer affects about 17,000 people, or muscle invasive bladder cancer, the most serious of bladder cancer, affects about 17,000 people annually in the United States. So it's not a terrible number of people, but these are really serious. Only about half of them get what is called curative procedures, which is the removal of their bladder. So this is a life-changing event. And only half of them get it because this surgery is so serious that the other half have a significant chance of dying during a procedure just because of the procedure. It's an all-day long procedure. Now, we went in, the phase 1 study was to treat using drug in this tool in these patients for a several-week period prior to removal of their bladder. We got permission to do that. So these were just a healthy group. The advantage of this kind of study is that we get the bladder and we can see the tumor. These are, to get into this study, they had to have like 3-centimeter sized tumors. These are monster tumors. And what we found in these 10 patients is that by histological examination of the tumor at the end, said that with the dose that we chose, this was early findings, like we had no reason to believe that this was the right dose, that we had complete ablation of these tumors in 4 out of the 10 patients. And in every case, we downstaged the patient. So it made the idea of, well, did we even choose the right dose? Did we choose the right exposure? I mean, if we'd done it longer, could we have gotten these patients? So it's seeming evidence that it's working. Well, the most important thing that came out of this was something that we hadn't anticipated. When they take these bladders, they take all the draining lymph nodes, which is a huge number. And only one of these patients with 3-centimeter muscle invasive tumor showed cancer in those draining lymph nodes, disseminated cancer. This, compared with historical, is like, generally speaking, 3/4 of these patients would have evidence of disseminated cancer. How is this possible? We're only delivering the drug to the bladder, but these draining lymph nodes have no tumor. This created the hypothesis that actually this kind of therapy actually is an immunotherapy. We cause necrosis of the tumor, not apoptosis. And as a result, over a 2-week period, and as a result, we're creating antigen in this process. And because we do it for 2 weeks, it's actually a vaccine. And then the patients mount. That was the hypothesis. We then took that information back and did preclinical models in support of that idea, to see whether that idea actually had merit. Not only, we proved that it does. So it turns out that in this case, it was a cytotoxic agent delivered to the bladder, not just acute exposure like you would normally do with a cytotoxic agent, but a prolonged exposure actually created new pharmacology, that the single compartment delivery is a way to take a drug and create a new pharmacological agent therapy by doing it this way. And that has borne out in other indications. This company was acquired again by Johnson & Johnson last December. That concept of single compartment delivery is now gone on to create new types of companies. This new company here, this is for delivery of drug to the ureter, just to the ureter, for treatment of stone disease. And my last bit, I'm gonna skip that. I'm just gonna go to a couple of comments about inventors. I think inventors and innovators have 3 things. In fact, I've told students now that I think the reason why you go to college is to get these 3 things, is develop a sense of curiosity, develop skills that in empathy and develop leadership skills. So what do I mean by curiosity? Well, curious people are collecting solutions to problems they haven't encountered yet. They're observing every phenomenon they can to store, and not knowing what to do with it, but store it in somewhere in long-term memory, because they can draw on those phenomena in putting together solutions. That's why you take all those crazy classes in college, is to help you, and you have no idea why you're taking them. It's not because you should know why you're taking them. It's because you should develop a sense of curiosity. How do you get excited about something that you have no idea how it affects your major? Well, you don't. How you'll use that information, it's up to you. Empathy. This is getting into the shoes of the customer. I think everybody on this call knows that you have customers. Seeing the world from your eyes is completely different than seeing the world from your customer's eyes. And I saw you how impactful, I told you how this was impactful for the development of 3D printing, is that getting into the shoes of the customer was had the most important impact on the whole industry. And then of course, leadership, what do leaders have? Well, they generally don't have much other than infectious enthusiasm and a balanced objectivity that make them believable. And it's important because no one of us has the skills to realize some of these concepts. I'm going to skip that. I want to get to the last thing because I want to leave time, like a few minutes for discussion. Power of stories. One of the downsides of not being able to visit MIT is that you won't be able to see the innovations we do in education. It's actually, it's a big deal at MIT education. People really struggle with it here. Every faculty member has to teach. It's not like Harvard where the faculty members don't teach and they have, part-time people do the teaching. It's a requirement. Nobody gets out of it. And so I became enamored with stories as a way of teaching, as a tool for teaching. And so I developed a number of years ago, 4 years ago, I developed this course called HSD 962, Health Sciences and Technology, on medical product development, where we would talk about not just drug development, but device development, not just hardware, but software. I wanted to have a course where I united all the concepts. And it was targeted at students early in their graduate career doing biomedical research. They were going to be deciding what research to do. And they have no idea about no exposure to what it takes to actually translate that idea. And so I wanted to create an intro course to development, to actually bring to them a vision of not just what happens at the beginning when you're deciding on a research path, but what happens at the end and how it impacts the decisions that you should make now. What you should think about even before you start the research. And the format was going to be different. They weren't going to listen to me. I'm just some MIT Yahoo. I was going to bring in experts. And the ideal thing would to actually bring them in physically. But it's really hard to do that. And of course, the people you want have very busy schedules. And so as a faculty member in charge of this course, I would not be in control of curating the ideas. The schedule would curate the ideas. And that did not appeal to me. So I spent 2 years going to them, going to the people, the movers and shakers in the industry, and sitting down with them for 90 minutes and videotaping a conversation. And then I get 90 minutes of, not videotape, but digital video. And I would curate that. I would break it up into 3-minute single ideas and bring together, all the things on reimbursement. The clips on reimbursement, they would be in one learning sequence, and it would be different people weighing in and saying diametrically opposed things right next to one another. So that when the student sees the sequence, we can then talk about and actually debate it. That was the concept. Now, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to play a short clip. This is a 2-minute video, and it's just 4 individuals, and it's not the same topic, but it gives you a flavor of not the people that were involved and the kind of impact it has. Just a story. By the way, I started by going to these people with an agenda. I would have, and I want to cover this topic, and after the 3rd interview, I threw that away because all these people had something to say and they wanted to say it, and I would just get out of the way. And if I did enough of these, 50 of them, over 50 of them, I would collect all that I needed.
There are many companies today that are developing products where they've gotten to a level of confidence about the ultimate impact of the product on patient outcomes and on, say, preventing downstream costly complications, hospitalizations, and the like, where they would like to take on some of the financial risk associated with actually delivering on those promises. Right now, the methods for doing that are still very much in development. So the methods that CMS has in place for paying for drugs and devices are kind of conditioned on the traditional mechanisms of healthcare reimbursement, where the general idea is that we pay on a fee-for-service basis for a drug or device.
Well, I believe that it's very important especially for chronic diseases, to have both objective measures that tend to be highly reproducible and have less noise, and also understand the patient experience of taking the drug.
So thinking about clinical proof of concept in all the companies we start, the first thing, or one of the first things we think about is, what does POC look like in the clinic? What will it take to design those trials? How long will it take us to get to those trials? And can we find POC in the clinic with the appropriate biomarker, with the appropriate next-gen sequencing today, or is it going to be a 3 or 4 or 5 year POC? We will typically not build companies around areas where we think the POC will take 3 or 4 years. We're looking for much more clear proof of concept in the clinic within 12 to 24 months.
I always thought that good science will result in good drugs. And now I realize that you don't have drugs without good science, but it's not enough. I realize that interface between discovery and early development is so fundamental that unless you don't know the science about it, drugs fail left and right.
Okay, so before I comment on sort of the nature of those, I'd just like to say something about the people. That Mark McClellan, he was a former head of CMS at Medicare. His budget there was over $1 trillion. Janet Woodcock, she's the head of CDER, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and she's now on assignment on the COVID thing, as you can imagine. But there isn't a drug approved in the United States without her signature on it. Mark Levin, he's the founder of a very influential investment firm, venture capitalist firm here in Boston. And Jose is long history in the drug industry. In fact, he did some of the early experiments in inflammatory disease that were associated with cofactor stimulation of immune cells, which of course he was doing it in the context of Crohn's disease, but it's become a big deal in cancer immunotherapy. So the people that I could bring to the students, it's not terribly interactive with them, but the close encounter they have with the kind of people here, it wouldn't have happened to bring them to MIT. And I can tell you this has been tremendously, having done it now for 4 years, I hear from students all the time that this has impacted how they have, what they've decided to do when in their research. And then over the past year, I'll call innovation, and if I don't sound too grandiose, but I'll call it an innovation for now, is now being rolled out into professional development. So we've done 7 cohorts of people in industry in this thing. And with an average time in the industry of 15 years. So these are not newbies to the industry. CEOs have taken this course now. And so this is the kind of thing that it was a concept. I'm hoping it's a true innovation, but I can tell you that other courses are being built in this model. And I can tell you every course I do develop now going forward is going to take an element of this. And the element is the stories important people tell. Okay, so I'll end there. Is there any questions? Or I can stop sharing.
I think yes. So folks, a couple of comments came in while you were talking. If you wouldn't mind, I think Cal, you had a couple of comments. Please go ahead. And anyone else, like I said, we've opened up the attendees, so please ask questions or make comments. This is meant to be a dialogue.
Well, thank you again, Michael. Always interesting to hear a lot of the stories from inventors. One of the characteristics that I've seen on people who actually invent or innovate is that they actually don't know that it's not impossible, or that everybody says it's impossible, and they actually just don't know that, and they just do it anyway. And we had a very good story at IBM. Dean and I worked on a project where Dean Mackey here, where Armonk and the research center basically said, Watson Research Center said that a certain type of software was impossible to scale. It actually couldn't be done. And we had already built it and the factory was already running.
Yeah. Oh, I get that. In my business, I get this a lot. But what you reminded me of something of important that I should have said, and it's very similar to your comment, is like, okay, you would think in medical product development that an important source of ideas would be physicians. That's true, and then also not true. Why do I say that? Well, it's because if you think about the training of a physician, they train by practice. They practice what they've been taught. And if you try to go to them for new ideas, you'll get new ideas, but they're always incremental, right? Because that's how they've learned. They don't step out of their comfort zone. And so I'm always very careful about how I use that particular customer and my research ideas, because they oftentimes I'll listen. I've studied how urologists' offices work. I know how every person in that office, what they're doing, why they're doing it, how much time is spent on this. I mean, that's really important to understand how they get paid, what are the expenses, all that kind of stuff. But if I had gone in there with, this pretzel thing, and from day one, they would have said, "You're crazy. I can't do that." Now there are thousands of people have had this thing in them. I mean, yes, it's still in development, but we're talking, a rapid growth here. And of course, it was careful orchestration of selling the idea selling the concept to the customer, because I'm sure there was a lot of people. Well, first off, they would have said, people will feel this in their bladder. It'll be uncomfortable, and I don't want to deal with the calls at midnight kind of thing. So we had to take that off the table. Our first trial was with empty systems and against a sham procedure. We took healthy volunteers. Can you imagine volunteering for something like this? I don't know. But they started, half of them blinded to them with an empty device, and others was just a sham procedure, just a catheterization. And we looked at the adverse events in both groups over the 2-week period they had them in. And the adverse events were identical. Adverse events, there were, complaints of, various complaints that you normally get, even with people with no procedures. Headache, we got that as an adverse event, but it was proof. I mean, we had to take that off the table before anybody would think that this was a reasonable thing to do.
Right. Other questions, comments? I see a lot of people nodding, so hoping that people would like to share their observations. Thomas, you always have an innovative opinion.
I'm sorry I have to say I came in late. I had a meeting beforehand, so I keep my questions for next time.
Okay.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right, folks. So we have a couple of minutes. If Dan, I see you unmuting, so please go ahead.
It's just a compliment, Michael, I enjoy your dialogue, the way you share your passion for it. It's nice to see it. It's inspiring. I enjoy it. And if you ever want to talk engines and engine repair, I'm available. Oh, yeah. It's a big hobby of mine too. Yes, I particularly like 2-stroke engines. So I've got many modified versions of it. And,
I got a lot of those too. It's actually more and more difficult. You can't get decent gas. I mean, now they're doing it without ethanol, but the water is just terrible in those things. And actually, I think it makes them more emission. It makes them more of an emission burden when they're running on ethanol than without it. So I don't know.
I mean, look, it's an example too where technology could have played a much bigger role in terms of providing a life for it, but market demand versus what's possible and the pieces of fad and direction and regulations and all that.
But it's being taken over by electric motors.
Yes,
you're really seeing that. Chainsaws and stuff like that, or
everything.
It's really
all of it. Even e-bikes. I mean, I have some bikes now that are Surons are coming and they're replacing dirt bikes basically, and they're electric powered. They're amazing machines. You can ride them around the yard all day. You don't bother your neighbors. Like, there's a whole new world that's really opening.
Yeah. So all these other engines will become antiques, and there'll be a whole kind of
They're gonna
market.
be like the steam engine. There'll be people building them as a hobby to be able to watch them run.
Exactly.
Old locomotive.
All right.
We had a question. Of course. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Dan. Michael, we had a question come in that I think might be very pertinent to sort of end this discussion. How might corporate leadership, which we have many of on this call, start to identify and then support inventors within their organization? And your inventors could be defined broadly, but from a senior leadership perspective, what can they do to foster those opportunities within their own organizations?
Yeah, well, it's tough, right? There's a bottom line in every case, but at MIT, I think it's like instituting a time each week for each employee, a certain amount of time where they devote to new ideas. So my contract, all MIT engineering faculty, their contract with MIT is for 4 days a week. the 5th day a week, you're not free to do anything in the 5th day a week, but it has to be scholarly or have impact. And MIT doesn't own it. So if I invent something, as long as I don't use significant use of MIT facilities, I can't go into my lab at MIT and invent something and then have it be mine. But my time on that 1 day a week can be spent outside of MIT having an impact. And my only obligation to MIT in this case is, so 20% of my time is to tell them how much time I actually spend and who I spend it with. Not what I get paid, not what not what I'm doing, but just generally speaking, how did it impact my professional development? So I've always done consulting. I work with, I've mentioned Millennium. I was doing consulting at Millennium. They were right on Sydney Street. I could walk there. It was a great consulting gig, right? I didn't have to get in the car to go anyplace. And I would be part of, right in the middle of a drug development program. I learned so much, and I would get paid to learn. It was like fantastic. And to me, that impacted not only what I was doing for Millennium, but my teaching, my research. Those concepts that I built were, that I discussed, were built at all these places. And so I guess what I'm saying is how I would at least think about doing it is requiring people, they have to be responsible, right? They have to report how this is impactful, how this was, impacting the business. But it's important to invest in your people. It's as much an investment in people as it is. So that's what I would do. The other thing is, I mentioned ways to do external innovation. And, 3D printing is a great example of that. These companies are saying, look, we don't want to build these things, but we want to make sure somebody's building them. And so how do they reduce the capital investment? They partner with non-competing industries to do it, right? And so building that kind of external innovation, a consortium of people to build an industry, supplier industry that supplies a machine or a service or something like that, is a great way to innovate. And that's sort of, as well as there's different ways to finance that, right? We're running into a lot of companies now. It's difficult to support research in the classic sense because it's an expense. Stock prices are high, amazingly high. So the P&L gets scrutiny dramatically. So they don't want to, they're actually, it's surprising, what they have access to in support of research is dropping. And so what they're doing is kind of a little bit of financial engineering, but the external innovation is in the form of investment. So a lot of the internal venture groups at these large corporations are investing in companies. They don't own more than 20%. So it doesn't, their auditors are not dragging in their the expenses at that company into their P&L. So it's now an asset. So the money they have to devote to these innovation activities is not being taxed, is the way I look at it, until there's something of value. So it's an investment. And so doing those types of both internal and external innovation is what I would be doing at companies. And I'm seeing companies doing that.
So I have a question in regards to this. We are doing actually exactly that, what you just said, but we have a hard time to get people motivated for that Friday, right? To not focus on work on that Friday, but focus on the innovation side, right? Focus on your creative side. Is there somehow something that you mentioned that they have to report in? But do you know how many of your colleagues actually take that Friday for exactly doing that? And how
yes, yes. You're able to do this anything that's scholarly or professional development. So a lot of, if you've ever edited a journal, I mean, it's a thankless job, but it's a tremendous amount of work. That would qualify. So there are a lot of my colleagues that provide that service to their field to edit it, be an editor in New England Journal or, something like that. So, which takes a lot of work. And that they would devote their time to do that, external society. But I would say most of my engineering faculty do as I've done. That they, I love MIT. It's been all my professional time. But let's face it, when I build something at MIT, it only has to work once. And when I build something at the companies I work with, it's a completely different discipline. And the problems I uncover there, that I experience there, are nothing I would see at MIT. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, why most of my colleagues do this thing. Now, back to your original question, how do you motivate people to do that? Tell them stories. The best way to change behavior is for them to listen to people that have done it. Mm-hmm. Well, like what is, I skipped a slide about what makes a productive small team, but one of them is that the team members have experienced excellence. They have, in their past, may not be at the company, maybe at past companies, but they've worked with somebody that has done this. And they tell the story about, hey, we did it this way, and where did the idea come from? And that story is the way you change behavior. And I totally, Elspeth said this in response to one of your questions, and it's like, that's exactly it. If you want to change behavior, do it with stories. Don't do it with data. Because people don't see themselves in the data, but they can see themselves in the story.
Right. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm muted. So if anybody, Cal, do you want to have the last comment, and then we can wrap up and take a break? But I want to give you a chance to ask your question or make a comment.
It was just a comment, Michael. I think that last comment was really important. To have actually experienced the feeling of a real success with a small team, and we often and one of the things that I always comment on is that when these big projects start, particularly on software projects, which are often sailings of the Titanic. They always start with balloons and cake, and I'm always going, if that's the way you're starting, it's a very bad sign, because, and sometimes they do start that way, and that's fine, and then I just sort of always remind them, just remember this moment. This is the happiest moment of this project.
It's interesting you bring it up. All your companies have successful small teams. They're a group of people, and there's always a tendency to let them keep going. But the other thing you can think of doing is, could you break up the team and have them seed their experiences with other teams? And, that they then tell a story. And, you might get hammered on by your manager, like, wait, why are we doing this? I mean, they're working great together. Why are we disrupting? Well, I've seen this, that you have one person in the group that has that kind of dynamic. It's infectious. And so anyway.
And I think the other thing, though, that sort of is a follow-on to that, is that the teams that actually do one part of this innovation, or do one portion of this success, don't necessarily carry on to do the rest of it and then actually put it into production and make it a real success for the company. Yeah. And I think that there are different people who do things well at different times.
Totally.
And and that's another thing.
I mean, it's like the people on the call that when you mentioned like floating the Titanic or steering the Titanic or software, same is true of drug development. When you think about all the people that have to come together to make a drug, it's amazing. And and it's like that too. I mean, it's a huge, you know, often $1 billion campaign to create a drug, and it's fraught with danger zones.
So Lars, you had a comment?
No, I just, first of all, thank you so much, Michael, for a fantastic presentation. There's just one comment that sort of comes in that I just wanted to say before I think we wrap up and move forward, because I've worked like at different universities throughout my career. And there's a few things that I've noticed at MIT. You know, there's people like Michael. There's one of the things about MIT. There's a lot of people like Michael, right? So where I used to work, that was a unique feature of having a professor who would both do fundamental research, pushing technology, and actually creating companies. And I think that obviously has something to do with the boundary conditions around MIT, then attracting those kind of people and sustaining that. But there's also another thing that might be a part of the secret sauce also. I think that's maybe what's interesting for some of the companies here is that the relationship between the professors and the PhD students. You often talk about, Michael, about the killer experiment, the way that you can sort of that push and really push the PhD students or the postdocs to not hedging. Like that you're not in the, you know, you're not in the zoo here, right? You're in the jungle, right? So there's this sort of, in a good way, relationship between the professors and the PhD students that I've never seen before. It's not aggressive, that's not what I'm saying, but it's really pushing people to go further than I've seen anywhere else. And I think that's also a part of it, right?
Yeah, in my course, I interviewed the CEO of Alnylam, and I'll never forget the quote there. He says, you know, I find a lot of my scientific staff, you know, caught into the trap of pushing out the killer experiment. Now, designing the killer experiment is hard, but we should be doing the killer experiment as fast as we possibly can. And so really talking about what the killer experiment is almost every day. You may not be able to implement it every day, but what is that killer experiment? What is going to tell you whether there's a product here or not? And I take that philosophy in my lab totally, because I don't want to waste, well, I certainly don't want to waste my time, but I don't want my students to waste their time either. So what is the killer experiment?
Folks, thank you so much. We ran a little bit late, but this was a great conversation. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 10:35. The next session is going to be very interactive. Everybody will get engaged voluntarily, or you might get drafted. So we look forward to it. We'll see you back in 10 minutes. Go get your coffee or your snacks or whatever. We'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Michael, I have a question for you offline. Was it Michael, or was it John Marganore you spoke with at Alnylam? I had the great pleasure of working for John at Biogen. He was he was one of the most amazing people to work with and for.
And he was at Millennium too when I was consulting.
Yep, he was. Yep.
So